Imagine for a second that you're just walking down your street, your usual commute. But instead of seeing solid, separate things like the cars parked on the curb or the oak trees, the brick buildings, the people walking their dogs, you see a glowing, dynamic web of connections.
It's a totally fluid environment.
Exactly. Everything around you is translucent. It's deeply interrelated, constantly shifting. The boundary between where you end and the street begins is completely porous.
Which sounds like something straight out of a heavy sci-fi film.
Right. But what if the way we see the world every single day, this incredibly mundane, solid, fiercely predictable world we just take for granted, what if that is actually a highly evolved, incredibly stubborn survival mechanism?
A mechanism that we're completely blind to.
Yeah. Yeah, and what if that very mechanism, the exact mental software that keeps us from walking blindly into moving traffic, is simultaneously causing a profound, almost tragic kind of spiritual blindness? Today, we are going completely down a rabbit hole. We are doing a deep dive into a really fascinating document titled 13, The Crystal Universe. And this material completely flips the script on what we consider to be baseline reality.
It really does. And it pairs that philosophical shift with a very specific visual aesthetic. To accompany the text, there's a striking visual provided. It's this watercolor painting that is incredibly ethereal.
Yeah, I spent a long time looking at that painting.
It's captivating. There's a person standing right in the center, just a simple, unadorned silhouette. But they are suspended between these floating geometric crystalline shapes. And surrounding everything, wrapping around the figure in those crystals, are these swirling lines of energy and interconnected, almost mathematical webs.
It's beautiful.
It is a beautiful image, but it's doing a lot of heavy lifting conceptually. It is actively challenging our most basic, unexamined assumptions about how we inhabit space.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the author doesn't ease us into this concept at all. They start with an absolute philosophical bombshell drawn from the 18th chapter of the Diamond Sutra. The quote is, and I'm reading right from the source here, "The past mind cannot be grasped, the future mind cannot be grasped, the present mind cannot be grasped."
It is a profoundly disorienting opening statement.
Yeah, it gives you intellectual vertigo.
That's exactly it. When you really sit with that quote, the immediate reaction is usually a kind of intellectual vertigo. Because if the past is gone, the future isn't here. And even the present mind is slipping through our fingers before we can even pin it down. Then what exactly are we holding on to? Where is our solid ground?
Nowhere, apparently.
Right. And the author is intentionally inducing that vertigo to set a very specific tone for the rest of the material. We're entering a discussion about states of incredibly high attentional stability, where the standard everyday architecture of human perception fundamentally shifts. And it is absolutely crucial to establish right up front that the author is not advocating for hallucinations.
Right, because when you throw around phrases like crystalline universe and glowing webs of energy, I think a lot of people immediately picture some kind of manufactured fantasy world, like, oh, we're just imagining pretty colors.
Exactly, and the text is actively pushing back against that assumption. We're not talking about a descent into imagination or, painting a new, pretty layer over a gritty reality. The author is pointing toward a profound, aggressively sober clarity.
Sober clarity.
Yes. It is about the removal of layers we didn't even realize we were projecting. The central argument is that this clarity is achieved through reduction. It's a stripping away of habitual, frantic mental overlays. So when the universe begins to appear crystalline, meaning it is perceived as a network of relations and pure potentials rather than a room full of discrete, chunky objects, it's not because we are hallucinating.
It's because we've stopped building the illusion.
Precisely. It's because we have finally stopped aggressively constructing it. We are seeing the raw data of reality that remains when the anxious mind simply stops trying to grasp and categorize everything it touches.
I really appreciate that distinction because it grounds the whole concept. We aren't trying to escape reality. We're trying to actually arrive at it. But to get there, we have to talk about what's standing in our way. And the text highlights a major obstacle to this clarity, which we can call the chair problem.
The chair problem, yes.
It's essentially the eternal battle between utility and presence. The argument here is that as adults, we are deeply, almost irreversibly conditioned to prioritize function over actual presence. We learn to see the world as stable, predictable, and frankly, completely unremarkable, simply so we can navigate it without being overwhelmed.
The author uses a chair to illustrate this, which is brilliant in its sheer mundanity. When you walk into a room and look at a chair, what are you actually seeing?
Usually just a place to sit.
Right. The argument is that you are not seeing a unique, never-before-assembled arrangement of wood grain. You aren't noticing the specific, unrepeatable way the afternoon light is hitting the varnish or the microscopic woven textures of the fabric. You are seeing a conceptual shorthand. Your brain flashes a mental sticky note that says chair. It's a category.
You know you can sit on it, it supports your weight, and that is absolutely the only thing your brain cares about in that moment.
Exactly. You replace the raw, incredibly rich, overwhelming data of your senses with a label.
But hold on, let me play devil's advocate for a second, because my immediate reaction to that is, thank goodness my brain does that. Like if I'm trying to cross a busy 4-lane intersection, I absolutely need to objectify those oncoming cars. I need to label them as heavy, fast, dangerous objects.
You definitely do.
Yeah, because if I stop to marvel at the beautiful, transient interplay of sunlight reflecting off a passing Honda Civic's bumper, I'm going to get run over. We need utility to survive, don't we? How do we balance this desire for presence with basic physical safety?
That is the core tension the text addresses. You are entirely correct that this labeling process is a highly efficient, biologically necessary survival mechanism.
It's how we get through the day.
It is. If you had to consciously process the raw, stunning reality of every single object you encountered, its atomic structure, its history, its shifting colors, you would be completely paralyzed by the sheer volume of sensory data. You wouldn't be able to cross the street, you couldn't make breakfast, you couldn't hold a job. The brain utilizes these conceptual shortcuts to conserve precious metabolic energy and optimize reaction time.
Which makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint.
Absolutely. But the author is forcing us to look at the massive hidden cost of this efficiency. The text calls this the calcification of perception. Over decades of adulthood, our perception becomes rigid, hard, and impenetrable. We gain total operational efficiency, but we suffer from a devastating spiritual blindness. We lose the immediate pristine quality of the world.
So it's a trade-off. We trade wonder for efficiency.
Precisely. The text compares this pristine state of uncalcified perception to the awareness of early childhood, long before the world has been completely dulled by the relentless demand for utility. Have you ever watched a toddler become utterly captivated by a seemingly worthless object?
Oh, all the time.
They will find a piece of lint on the carpet or watch the dust motes dancing in a shaft of sunlight, and they will study it with the intensity of a scientist discovering a new galaxy.
Yes. You buy a kid an incredibly expensive interactive toy for their birthday, and they spend 45 minutes completely mesmerized by the cardboard box it came in. Because to them, the box isn't a utility item meant to be thrown in the recycling bin. It's a whole universe of texture, sound, spatial dimensions, and possibility. It hasn't been locked into a single definition yet.
And in the context of our source material, this effort to recapture that fluid way of seeing introduces us to a framework drawn from ancient alchemy.
Okay, alchemy. Let's get into this.
The text refers specifically to the albedo phase. Now, in historical alchemy, the great work, the magnum opus, is divided into stages. The albedo is the second stage. It literally translates to whitening. But to understand the albedo, you really have to understand what precedes it, which is the negrito.
The negrito. The text doesn't dive too deeply into that, but it implies a breaking down process. What does that actually look like in this context?
The negrito is the blackening, the putrefaction. In psychological terms, it represents the collapse of your existing conceptual frameworks. It is the realization that your rigid, heavily labeled world is fundamentally unsatisfying and hollow.
So it's not a fun phase.
Not at all. In modern terms, you might experience the negrito as severe burnout, an existential crisis, or a profound sense of alienation. It is the painful shattering of the calcified perception. You realize the labels aren't working anymore. Only after that breakdown can you enter the albedo, which is the phase of purification and washing.
So the albedo is where we start cleaning the lens.
Yes. The text uses albedo to describe the psychological stage where one learns to actively reverse the calcification. The goal is a precise, deconditioned awareness. But what's fascinating here is that the author makes a very careful distinction. This is not a regression.
Meaning we aren't trying to literally become toddlers again. Because going back to my crosswalk example, a toddler will absolutely wander into traffic. They lack the functional capacity to survive on their own.
Correct. The adult mind in the albedo phase retains its full capacity for reason, spatial navigation, and logic. But it intentionally recovers the capacity for direct, unmediated contact with reality. It is an integration, an advancement of consciousness, not a retreat into infancy. You can still see the car coming, but you are no longer trapped in a world composed entirely of dead, static labels.
We want the wonder of the cardboard box, but we still need to know how to pay our taxes and drive to work. That makes perfect sense. But it brings up a really common counterargument, and I'm glad the author tackles this head-on in the text.
Shortcut argument.
Exactly, because whenever you start talking about dissolving boundaries, seeing glowing webs of connection and lifting the veil of everyday utility, a significant portion of the audience is going to point to pharmacology. They will say, I know exactly how to achieve that state. I just need to take a high dose of psilocybin mushrooms or LSD or DMT.
And they aren't entirely wrong about the immediate effect.
Right. We have decades of research, both clinical and anecdotal, proving that these agents radically alter perception. And the text actually acknowledges this reality. It notes that certain chemical substances can violently disrupt the brain's objectifying mechanisms. They absolutely can dissolve the filters that dull our sensory field, making everything look incredibly raw, fluid, and interconnected.
It mimics the crystalline universe.
It sounds identical to the crystalline universe the author is describing, yet the source material draws a hard, unforgiving line between those chemically altered states and genuine, sober clarity. It basically dismisses psychedelics as a shortcut trap.
The reasoning behind that dismissal is fascinating, because it avoids moralizing. The text isn't arguing that these substances are inherently evil or sinful. It is making a purely structural argument about the nature of the mind. The author explains the chemical disruptions, along with states brought on by extreme physical fatigue or severe psychological shock, are inherently unstable and non-integrative.
So they don't last.
Right. When you ingest a chemical that disrupts the neural pathways responsible for your conceptual overlays, your default mode network, in neuroscientific terms, you do indeed lift the veil of utility. You might have a breathtaking, life-altering experience of universal oneness. The world might literally appear crystalline. But the operative word in all of this is temporarily.
Because the body eventually metabolizes the chemical. The trip ends.
Precisely. Once the chemical leaves your system, the brain's habitual filters, the karmic momentum of your entire life, slam right back into place. And very often, they return just as rigidly as before, sometimes even more so because the ego feels threatened by the dissolution it just experienced. You haven't actually purified the perceptive mechanism, you've merely forcefully bypassed it for a period of 6 to 12 hours.
The analogy that comes to mind is a dam blocking a river.
Oh, that's a good one.
The dam is our calcified perception, our utility filters. Taking a massive dose of psychedelics is like blowing a hole in the center of the dam with dynamite. The water rushes through, the force is spectacular, you see the river flow freely, but the fundamental structure of the dam is still there.
Right, the concrete hasn't gone anywhere.
Exactly. And eventually, the authorities, your ego, your habitual mind, rush in and patch the hole with even thicker concrete the next day. You got a beautiful glimpse of the river, but you don't actually get to live on its banks.
That analogy captures the author's critique perfectly. A glimpse is not integration. In the albedo phase, the objective is the permanent, painstaking removal of obscuring habits. You have to dismantle the dam stone by stone, consciously and deliberately. True purification must be integrative.
So it has to be a baseline shift.
Yes. The text insists that when this perceptual clarity arises through genuine, disciplined practice, it becomes reproducible. It is your new baseline. It is sober, and critically, it does not rely on external intervention. If you rely on a chemical to achieve the crystalline state, you are still entirely bound by cause and effect. You are still a victim of external conditions dictating your internal state.
You're relying on a substance rather than your own awareness.
Right. The albedo work is about reclaiming your own inherent perceptive clarity, making the realization of the interconnected universe an everyday reality, not just a weekend escape.
Which naturally leads us to the mechanics, because if we can't just blow up the dam with dynamite, how do we dismantle it stone by stone? The text introduces what it calls the central operational insight of this entire stage, which is the freeing of phenomena.
This is where the philosophy gets very applied.
It's a heavy, somewhat dense concept. As I read it, the basic premise is that in our standard everyday perception, we encounter an object, instantly slap a label on it, like our chair, and immediately fit it into a narrative of past memory or future utility. The radical claim here is that we almost never actually see the object itself. We are only ever looking at our memory of the object. We are literally hallucinating our past onto the present moment.
That's a very accurate summary.
So to free phenomena is to recognize that things, any object, thought, or feeling we experience, lack an intrinsic, solid, unchanging core.
The author uses a gorgeous classic analogy to explain this lack of intrinsic solidity, the red rose.
Right, the rose.
When we walk through a garden and perceive a red rose, our mind immediately slaps the static singular label rose onto it. We assume we know what it is, but if you analyze it scientifically or even just through sustained, careful observation, it is never the same rose twice.
It's constantly changing.
Constantly, its cellular structure is actively shifting every millisecond. It is simultaneously decaying and growing. Water is moving through its stem. The ambient light reflecting off its petals is constantly changing based on the position of the sun and the passing clouds. It is a hive of activity. Yet our mind takes this incredibly fluid, highly dynamic, momentary reality and binds it with a false permanence. We freeze the river so we can name it, and then we mistake the name for the reality.
I love that phrase. We freeze the river so we can name it. That perfectly captures the tragedy of how we perceive things. So how does the text suggest we unfreeze it?
To understand the depth of what it means to truly free that rose from our conceptual freezing, the text brings in a foundational concept from Buddhist epistemology. It refers to the realization of Suññatā, which is usually translated into English as emptiness.
Let's pause right there because emptiness is a notoriously difficult word in English. I think when most of us hear the word emptiness, we immediately picture a bleak, dark void. We think of a nihilistic vacuum where nothing matters, a kind of depressing cosmic black hole.
Yes, and the text explicitly works to correct that deeply ingrained Western misunderstanding. Emptiness in this philosophical context is absolutely not a bleak void. It is the exact opposite. It is a recognition of pure, unbridled fluidity.
Pure fluidity.
Yes. The author quotes an incredibly famous line from the Heart Sutra to illustrate this. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. Form does not differ from emptiness, and emptiness does not differ from form.
Okay, unpack that for me. Because to a layperson, that sounds like a riddle. How can form, the solid stuff of the world, the chair, the table, be the exact same thing as emptiness?
What the sutra is stating is that matter is not solid in the way our calcified perception assumes it is. Form, the physical stuff of the universe, is merely a temporary configuration of causes, conditions, and energy fields. Because a rose is empty of a permanent, unchanging, independent essence, it is free to transform.
So if it wasn't empty, it would be stuck.
Exactly. If the rose were not empty, if it possessed a static, eternal roseness that could never be altered, it would be a dead plastic imitation. It couldn't pull nutrients from the soil, it couldn't be affected by the sun, it couldn't bloom, and it couldn't eventually wilt and return to the earth. The emptiness of the rose is precisely what allows it to interact with the rest of the universe. Its emptiness is its profound potential.
So emptiness isn't a black hole, it's more like a blank canvas. Actually, no, a canvas is too static. It's more like the ocean. The ocean is empty of any fixed, permanent waves, which is exactly why it has the capacity to form endless, beautiful, temporary waves. The emptiness is the capacity for life.
That is a superb analogy. The ocean's lack of a fixed shape allows for all shapes, and the crux of the human dilemma, according to the text, lies in our emotional reaction to this inherent fluidity. The unexamined mind is utterly terrified of this constant shifting.
We want things to stay the same.
Desperately. We desperately want the rose to stay a beautiful, unblemished red rose forever. We want the people we love to never age, never change their minds, and never leave us. We want our own identities, our egos, to be solid, secure, and permanent. This deeply ingrained habit, the fierce clinging to perceived stability in a universe that is fundamentally structurally fluid, is identified by the author as the root mechanism of samsara.
Samsara being the cycle of suffering, right?
Yes, the cycle of profound dissatisfaction, suffering, and worldly wandering. We suffer because we continually demand that the universe be solid, and the universe relentlessly refuses to comply with our demand. It cannot comply because its nature is empty and fluid. Freeing phenomena means finally aligning our perception with the actual fluid nature of reality, rather than fighting a painful, exhausting, and ultimately losing battle against it.
Which brings us to where the text gets incredibly practical and, frankly, really challenging. Because it provides a comparative breakdown, a literal side-by-side table contrasting our normal way of operating, which it calls standard objectification, with this awakened way of seeing termed crystalline insight.
Yes, this is where the rubber meets the road.
It takes all these soaring philosophical concepts, emptiness, the Albedo phase, the Heart Sutra, and grounds them in how we actually experience a random Tuesday afternoon. I want to walk through this table carefully because this is the operational core of the document. The first point of comparison focuses on the nature of the object. Under standard objectification, we see an object as solid, separate, and enduring. It's a noun. It's the static rose we just talked about.
Right.
But under crystalline insight, the object is perceived as a transient convergence of conditions. It is an event. It's a verb. The rose is an event of soil, sunlight, water, and genetic coding temporarily throwing a party together.
That shift from noun to verb is monumental. It changes everything about how you interact with your environment. You stop trying to possess things and start participating in events. And the second point in the table addresses the mechanism of this shift, focusing on the filter.
The filter.
In standard perception, as we discussed with the chair, our perception is heavily filtered through memory and utility. We name the object immediately so we can use it, ignore it, or run away from it. Crystalline insight, however, requires a perception that is direct, fresh, and preconceptual. You are training yourself to apprehend the visual, auditory, or tactile data before the language centers of the brain have a chance to categorize it and slap a sticky note on it. You are trying to drink from the raw data stream.
Which naturally disrupts the third point in the comparison, the boundary. This point ties perfectly back to that ethereal watercolor image we described at the very beginning of the deep dive. Under standard objectification, the viewer feels like a static, isolated subject.
The homunculus in the head.
Yes. You feel like a little homunculus, an ego, sitting right behind your eyes, peering out at a totally external, deeply separate, often hostile world. The boundary is rigid. I am in here, and the universe is out there. But when you shift into crystalline insight, the boundary between the observer and the observed becomes remarkably fluid. Just like those swirling energy lines in the painting that wrap around the figure and the floating crystals, you realize that you, the observer, are also just a transient convergence of conditions. You are intimately woven into the very environment you thought you were separate from.
And if we extrapolate that dissolution of the boundary, it profoundly impacts the fourth and final point in the table,
Right.
which I think is the most consequential for our daily lives. That is the reaction.
This is the big one.
Normally, in standard objectification, our reaction to an object, a situation, or a person is almost entirely emotional and heavily based on history. We either like it, dislike it, or feel bored by it, purely based on our past catalog of experiences. We are effectively slaves to our own conditioning. We think we are making free choices, but we're just running old scripts.
But under crystalline insight,
In crystalline insight, reaction is suspended. The text notes that awareness simply rests in observation. Because you are not projecting your past onto the object, and because the boundary between you and the object is recognized as fluid, there is no solid, defensive you to be offended or infatuated by a solid, external it. There is simply the dynamic unfolding of the present moment.
I really want to pause here and ask you, the listener, to think about how this table applies to the minutiae of your daily life. Let's take a really mundane example. Think about a coworker who constantly annoys you, or maybe a public figure you absolutely despise, or even a household chore you hate doing, like folding laundry.
Folding laundry is a great example.
Right. When you encounter that person or that task, how much of your reaction is actually based on fresh, direct, preconceptual observation of the present moment? And how much of it is an immediate historical emotional reflex? I'll give you a personal example. I have a colleague, I won't name names, who can be very blunt in messages.
Yeah.
I realized recently that whenever I see their name pop up on a notification, my blood pressure spikes before I even read a single word of the message.
Before you even know what they want.
Exactly. I am not reacting to the text on the screen. I am reacting to my memory of every slightly abrasive interaction I've ever had with them. I am reacting to a phantom, a ghost built out of my own history. If I could suspend that reaction, if I could apply crystalline insight and view that notification purely as a transient convergence of pixels on a screen fresh, without the historical filter, how much unnecessary stress and bodily tension would just instantly evaporate.
It is a staggering amount of wasted energy, isn't it? Your example perfectly illustrates the practical application of freeing phenomena. You are freezing the river of your relationship with your coworker based on past data. But this leads to a very challenging question, one the text anticipates and addresses next.
Because we have to ask why we do this to ourselves.
Exactly. If this standard objectification, this constant projecting of the past onto the present, causes us so much bodily stress and psychological dissatisfaction, why on earth does the mind violently insist on doing it? If it's a software bug, why haven't we patched it?
Right. Evolutionary biology usually weeds out things that are purely detrimental.
It does. And the author argues that it is not merely a biological convenience or a quirky flaw in our evolution. It is a profound karmic necessity. And to explain the mechanics of this necessity, the text draws heavily on the Yogacara school of Buddhism.
Okay, Yogacara. Let's set the stage for this.
So Yogacara flourished in India in the early centuries of the Common Era, and it provides arguably one of the most sophisticated, nuanced psychological models of the human mind ever developed in antiquity. The text introduces a core Yogacara concept called Alaya Vijnana, which translates to the storehouse consciousness.
The storehouse consciousness. This is where things get really deep. The text includes a summarized quote from a Sangha who was a massive foundational figure in the Yogacara tradition. It's from his text, the Mahayana Samgraha. It says, "This mind of ours is storehouse consciousness. All that we think and do is stored there as seeds that ripen in future experiences." This metaphor of seeds is brilliant. Can you explain this to me like I'm 5? Is this storehouse basically like a subconscious hard drive where all our memories are saved as files?
Calling it a hard drive is a decent starting point, but a hard drive is too passive. The storehouse consciousness is highly active. Let's break down the mechanism of how these seeds actually work in real time. According to the Yogacara model, the standard mind operates on recognition. It is constantly, frantically, and unconsciously scanning the present moment for patterns that match our past experiences of pleasure or pain.
Like a radar.
More like a highly aggressive facial recognition software running 24 hours a day. When it scans the environment and finds a match, say, the smell of a specific perfume, the layout of a room, or in your case, the name of your blunt coworker popping up on a screen, it immediately triggers a reaction. You either grasp at the object because the pattern promises pleasure, or you violently push it away because the pattern threatens pain or annoyance.
Okay, so the seed sprouts into a reaction.
Yes. But here's the insidious part, the true engine of karma. That very act of compulsive reaction, your blood pressure spiking, your feeling of annoyance, reinforces the pattern. By reacting, you are laying down a brand new, slightly stronger seed right back into your storehouse consciousness.
Oh, wow.
It is a perfectly closed, self-sustaining feedback loop. The past dictates your present reaction, and your present reaction solidifies your future behavior. You are entirely trapped in your own history.
That sounds incredibly bleak. If it's a perfectly closed loop, how do we ever break out of it? Because if every time I react to my coworker out of habit, I'm just making the habit stronger for tomorrow, then the storehouse consciousness just becomes a deeply rutted, muddy road that I can't steer my car out of.
It is bleak if left unexamined. But the text proposes that the only way to break this karmic feedback loop, to get the car out of the rut, is precisely through the practice we've been discussing, the freeing of phenomena. Let's think about the mechanics of this intervention. If you can manage, even for a split second, to perceive the present moment as entirely fresh, if you look at the notification on your screen completely unlocked from old interpretations, labels, and historical grudges, what happens to the spanning mechanism?
Well, the scanner looks for a match, but because I'm not feeding it the label annoying coworker, it comes up empty.
Exactly. The mind frantically searches the storehouse. But because you are seeing the object preconceptually in its raw, fluid state, the mind finds no match. It doesn't recognize this situation as a mere repetition of the past. And if it doesn't recognize it, it cannot trigger the old habits of grasping or aversion. You don't get annoyed. And because you didn't get annoyed, you don't plant a new seed. The engine of karma is suddenly starved of its fuel.
The engine just stops running. You break the circuit. The text says something really beautiful regarding this moment of breakage. The radiance of the crystalline universe is simply the energy of the world released from the stranglehold of our projections. It is not added to the world. It is revealed when the interpretive strain is removed.
Interpretive strain. What a perfect way to phrase it.
I absolutely love that phrase. It highlights just how physically and mentally exhausting it is to constantly be projecting our past onto the present. We are white-knuckling our way through reality, trying to force every single moment to conform to our storehouse of seeds. When we finally stop straining, when we drop the baggage, reality naturally radiates. It was always glowing. We were just too busy projecting to see it.
It takes so much energy to maintain the illusion of solidity.
It really does. But the text doesn't just leave us with this high-level philosophy and wish us luck. It actually gives us a concrete framework for how to deconstruct our solid reality in real time. It introduces a contemplative tool called the elemental gradient, or the elemental cascade.
Yes, the text utilizes a classical Indian elemental schema space: wind, fire, water, and earth. But it is very careful to clarify up front that in this specific contemplative context, we're not talking about literal physical dirt or actual combustion flames or H2O.
So it's not the periodic table of elements?
No, not at all. These are experiential metaphors. They're used to describe increasing degrees of perceptual density. It's essentially a map of how human experience solidifies, charting the journey from pure, open potential all the way down into rigid, heavy, undeniable objects. The theory is that as the mind's attention moves from openness toward fixation and grasping, the experience appears progressively more tangible, resistant, and solid. Let's walk through this cascade step by step, because it functions as a brilliant reverse engineering guide for human perception.
Okay, let's start at the very top of the cascade, the most subtle, refined level of experience. The first element is space, or akasha in Sanskrit. The text describes its primary quality as openness and potentiality.
Right.
In terms of perception, this is the ground of awareness itself. No distinct forms or thoughts have yet arisen. It's pure, unobstructed capacity. It is the blank canvas before the first drop of paint hits it. Then, out of that infinite space, we get the second element, wind, or vayu. Its defining quality is movement and vibration.
That's where things start to stir.
Exactly. This is the very first stirring of distinction. It's a sense of force and direction, but it doesn't have a coherent shape yet. It's like the feeling of a breeze on your skin before you hear the leaves move or know where the wind is coming from.
Moving down the gradient, things begin to get denser. That subtle vibration of winds generates friction, which inevitably leads to the third element, fire, or teshash. Its quality is transformation and heat. In the perceptual stage, this is the arising of noticeable energy, dynamism, and change. The phenomena are beginning to gather energy and definition, but this energy is chaotic. It needs to bind together to form something stable, which leads directly to the fourth element, water, or apas.
Water binds things.
Yes. Its quality is cohesion and attraction. Here, the energetic dynamism binds into recognizable patterns. It gains fluidity in relation. The parts are holding together. And finally, that cohesion becomes totally fixed and rigid, bringing us to the very bottom of the cascade, the fifth element, earth, or prithvi. Its quality is solidity and resistance. This is the final fixation into rigid, separate, heavy objects. This is the world of things as we normally perceive them. This is where the label chair lives.
The text provides a fascinating, highly practical example of how an alchemist or a contemplative practitioner uses this cascade to deconstruct reality. It says an alchemist learns to perceive the wind and fire inherent in the earth. So imagine an alchemist looking at a totally solid, heavy, antique wooden table. To our standard calcified perception, it's just earth. It's rigid. It's resistant. If I punch it, I'll break my hand.
Unyielding.
Right. But the alchemist, through the intense practice of freeing phenomena, looks deeper. They train their mind to see that the solid table is actually a complex cohesion of forces holding together. That's the water element binding it. They see that it is currently undergoing slow, invisible transformation. The wood is subtly aging. The varnish is oxidizing. It's interacting with the humidity in the room. That's the fire element.
It's a slow burn.
Exactly. And all of this is occurring within a fundamental field of vibration and movement at the atomic and energetic level. That's the wind element. They conceptually deconstruct the dense earth back up the cascade toward space.
Now, I anticipate a skeptic's reaction here. If I punch the table, I break my hand. The table is solid. End of story. And the text makes a crucial point to address this. This cascade is not literal physics. Yes, modern quantum physics would actually agree that a wooden table is mostly empty space and vibrating atoms. But the alchemist isn't doing mathematical physics. As the text states, this is a phenomenological stance.
Phenomenology being the study of our subjective experience.
Correct. The practitioner is actively adopting this viewpoint, specifically to prevent their own mind from getting stuck on the superficial, resistant surfaces of reality. It's a cognitive exercise. If you can train yourself to intuitively feel the vibration, the ongoing transformation, and the delicate cohesion within a seemingly solid, heavy object, you break the spell of its absolute permanence. You actively loosen the claustrophobic grip of standard objectification. You are intentionally walking your perception back up the ladder from dense, unyielding earth back toward open, spacious potential.
It's an active process of unlearning. It's like taking off the VR headset that projects a solid, threatening world and learning to read the flowing lines of code underneath it. And that incredibly difficult, disciplined work leads us to the final, ultimate goal of this entire process, a state the text refers to as functional cessation.
Yes, achieved through the unified practice of shamatha vipassana.
Right.
Now, shamatha generally translates to calm abiding, the practice of deeply tranquilizing and focusing the mind, and vipassana translates to profound insight or clear seeing. When these two capacities are perfectly unified in deep meditation, something radical is said to happen. The text states that the subjectivity that constantly narrates our experience may temporarily cease. But it immediately qualifies this, and I need you to explain this to me like I'm 5, because cessation sounds terrifying.
It sounds like annihilation.
It sounds like dying? Am I a zombie in this state? Does my ego literally just shut off?
It is completely understandable why that word triggers alarm. We are deeply identified with our internal narrator. But the distinction the text makes is paramount. It calls it a functional cessation, not an absolute biological annihilation. You do not become a zombie, you do not drop dead, and you don't go into a catatonic coma. As the text explicitly explains, the biological organism continues to function perfectly well. The heart beats, the lungs breathe, the nervous system processes data. Agency remains. You can still walk, talk, and act compassionately in the world.
So what ceases then? What ceases, what finally goes quiet, is the compulsive, agonizing, self-referencing mechanism, the incessant internal narrator, the heavily constructed anxious I that constantly claims every single experience as mine, my pain, my joy, my opinion, my solid wooden table. That deeply exhausting voice falls completely blessedly silent.
The narrator retires.
Exactly. And to reinforce the profound importance of this cessation, the text provides one last anchoring quote, this time from the Dhammapada, verse 277. All compounded things are subject to cessation. Understanding this with wisdom, one is freed from suffering.
All compounded things, meaning absolutely anything made of parts, which, according to the elemental cascade we just walked through, is absolutely everything we perceive as solid in this universe. Even our own ego, our deeply cherished sense of a solid, unchanging self, is just a compounded thing.
It is.
It's merely a temporary cohesion of memories, bodily habits, traumas, and physical sensations. And when that relentless narrator finally falls silent, the text says the divide between the internal and the external is no longer sharply defined. Awareness moves effortlessly. The boundary we talked about earlier is completely structurally gone. So, to bring this all together, what does this ultimately mean for the Albedo work we discussed at the very beginning of the deep dive?
The text synthesizes all of this beautifully in the final paragraph. It states that this profound state of internal silence is the necessary, non-negotiable condition for true Albedo work. The ultimate goal is to cultivate a mind that possesses two seemingly contradictory qualities.
Which are?
First, it must be incredibly distinct and sharp, like a diamond, able to effortlessly cut through the illusions, the historical biases, and the conceptual labels. But simultaneously, it must be perfectly transparent, allowing the light of reality, the raw, dynamic, fluid, preconceptual data of the universe to pass completely through it without any distortion, without any old karmic seeds casting a dark shadow on the present moment.
That is a remarkable, elegant synthesis of ancient wisdom and psychological insight. The diamond mind doesn't actively add anything to reality. It doesn't try to paint the world in pretty, mystical, hallucinatory colors. It merely acts as a flawless, unobscured lens.
A clear lens, yes.
And achieving that requires immense, often uncomfortable discipline. It requires the profound willingness to let go of the comforting, predictable, heavy solidity of the world we think we know so well. It requires facing the emptiness, the Suññatā, and realizing, perhaps for the first time, that it is not a terrifying void, but the very source of all dynamism, connection, and life. The Albedo work is the sobering, reproducible daily process of polishing that diamond mind, painstakingly stripping away the karma, the historical baggage, and the relentless demand for utility until only the clear, radiant light of the present moment remains.
Beautifully said.
This has been an incredibly dense journey because 13, the crystal universe, covers a staggering amount of philosophical and psychological ground. We started by confronting the everyday trap of utility, realizing how our necessary survival mechanisms force us to slap conceptual sticky notes on reality, effectively blinding us to the vibrancy of the present moment. We looked deeply at the red rose and realized we usually only ever see our static memory, not the fluid living event happening right in front of us.
We freeze the river.
We freeze the river. We debated and bypassed the temptation of chemical shortcuts, understanding that true, lasting purification must be permanent, sober, and fully integrated into daily life. We dove deep into the mechanics of our own psychology, uncovering the Yogacara concept of the karmic storehouse consciousness, and saw clearly how our constant, frantic need to match the present to the past creates an endless loop of reaction, annoyance, and suffering.
The facial recognition software.
Right. Then we learned a practical method to deconstruct the crushing solidity of the world using the elemental cascade, finding the subtle wind and transformative fire hidden inside the heavy earth. And finally, we arrived at the profound concept of functional cessation, quieting the exhausting internal narrator to cultivate a mind that is as sharp and transparent as a diamond. My biggest takeaway from this entire deep dive is a powerful reminder that this crystalline clarity, this glowing, interconnected web of potential, is not something we have to desperately build or achieve by adding some new, expensive spiritual practice to our cluttered lives.
Yeah, it's already there.
It is entirely a process of subtraction. It is a meticulous stripping away of our own anxious noras, our historical biases, and our desperate, terrified need for things to be solid and predictable. The beauty, the radiance is already there, patiently hidden right underneath our own labels.
It truly is a profoundly hopeful message, even though it masquerades as a rigorous, almost ruthless psychological deconstruction. As we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. A practical way to test this philosophy out in the laboratory of your own life this week. The next time you catch yourself immediately disliking a mundane object or feeling a sudden flash of irritation at a highly familiar situation, maybe it's a specific tone of voice your partner uses, or an email from that blunt coworker, or a repetitive chore you resent having to do, just stop. Pause for one full second and ask yourself a difficult question. Are you actually reacting to what is physically in front of you right now, in this precise, entirely unrepeatable second of your life? Or are you just blindly watering a forgotten bitter seed deep in your storehouse consciousness? What would happen if, just for a moment, you dropped the heavy label, intentionally suspended your historical reaction, and let that solid, incredibly annoying object dissolve back up the cascade into space and wind? You might just find the universe radiating a little more clearly than it did yesterday.